The desert didn't kill with bullets. It killed with patience. At 0947 hours on August 14, 1942, the Sahara reached 120 degrees Fahrenheit. The kind of heat that turned air into a physical weight pressing down on your lungs. The kind of heat where metal became an enemy. Clyde McVeigh stood in the center of what looked like a battlefield after an artillery strike, except the casualties weren't men, they were machines. 47 plumes of black smoke rose into the white-hot sky like funeral markers. The stench of burning oil mixed with the acrid bite of superheated metal, creating a smell so thick you could taste it on your teeth. Each column of smoke represented a Jeep engine that had died screaming, pistons welding themselves to cylinder walls, coolant flash-boiling into nothing, radiator cores collapsing inward like crushed tin cans. The sound was worse than the smell, the death ticks. The mechanics called them. That rapid tick-tick-tick-tick of metal expanding beyond its tolerance, followed by the wet crunch of a gasket blowing, then silence. 47 times in 3 hours, that silence had rolled across the convoy like a plague. McVeigh wiped the sweat from his forehead with a grease-blackened hand and looked down the line. Men stood helplessly beside their dead vehicles, some with their hands on their hips, others kneeling in the sand like mourners at a grave. The Admiral's command jeep sat 20 yards away, its hood still up, the radiator glowing a dull cherry red, even though the engine had been off for 30 minutes. The brass had built those engines by the book. Every specification met, every part factory perfect. Every single one now worth less than scrap. Behind McVeigh, the mud fly idled. Not purred, idled. The sound was ugly, punctuated by the rhythmic whoop-whoop-whoop of the external fan blades he'd bolted to the front bumper. Tin can bypass valves glinted in the sun, like some kind of folk art sculpture. Baling wire held half the cooling system together. It looked like something a sharecropper would build to keep a tractor running through harvest season. But it was running. McVeigh reached into his coverall pocket and pulled out a dented canteen, took a long pull of water that was hot enough to brew tea, and allowed himself something he rarely did in front of the brass. A smile. Not a smirk. Not a grin of satisfaction. Just the quiet, knowing smile of a man who'd tried to warn them. A man they'd laughed at in the mess hall. A man the Admiral had threatened with a court-martial for vandalizing government property. The Admiral walked toward him now, his face the color of a slapped ham, his uniform dark with sweat circles. McVeigh could see it in the officer's eyes, the exact moment a man's pride calculates the cost of survival. The mudfly's engine kept ticking. Alive. Breathing. The only heartbeat left in a graveyard of American steel. Before we dive into the heat of battle, make sure to subscribe to the channel for more untold stories of woe to grit. Drop a comment below with your location and the time you're watching this. Clyde McVeigh learned about engines the way most boys learned about God, through a mixture of reverence, fear, and the certainty that if you listened carefully enough, they'd tell you exactly what was wrong. He was 8 years old the first time he saved a harvest. His father's John Deere had thrown a rod 3 rows into the soybean field, and the nearest mechanic was 40 miles away in Springfield. They didn't have 40 miles worth of gasoline money. They barely had food money. So while his father sat on the porch smoking hand-rolled cigarettes and cursing the Depression, young Clyde crawled under that tractor with a ball-peen hammer, a coffee can full of rusty bolts, and a length of baling wire his mama had been saving for the clothes line. 6 hours later, the engine turned over. It sounded like a bag of hammers being shaken by an angry drunk. But it ran. His father didn't say thank you. He just pointed at the field and said, "Finish the rows before dark." That was the Ozarks way. Competence wasn't praised, it was expected. Failure was what got discussed. By the time McVeigh was 16, he could rebuild a tractor engine blindfolded. By 18, farmers were bringing him machinery that certified mechanics had declared dead. He worked out of a lean-to shed behind his family's tobacco plot, his payment usually coming in the form of a chicken, a sack of cornmeal, or the promise of help when McVeigh's own fields needed working. He never wrote anything down. Didn't need to. An engine was a conversation, and McVeigh spoke the language fluently. Then December 7th, 1941 happened, and the world caught fire. McVeigh enlisted January 2nd, partly out of patriotism, mostly because tobacco prices had collapsed and the farm was bleeding money. The recruiting officer took one look at his grease-stained hands and assigned him to the mechanized infantry without asking a single question. "You'll fit right in," the man said. He didn't. Fort Benning was a different universe. The Army had manuals for everything, 37 pages on how to change a spark plug, 16 pages on proper coolant mixture ratios, an entire chapter on the correct way to store a wrench. McVeigh read them once, mostly out of curiosity about what kind of person needed instructions that detailed. The other mechanics read them like scripture, referencing page numbers during repairs, following procedures with religious precision. McVeigh just fixed things. That's when the trouble started. A sergeant caught him bypassing a faulty voltage regulator with a jury-rigged resistor made from repurposed radio parts. "That's not in the manual, Private." McVeigh had shrugged. "Manual's wrong. Voltage regulators designed for stateside humidity. It'll fail in 3 weeks." The sergeant wrote him up. The voltage regulator failed in 2 weeks and 4 days. The brass didn't like being right the wrong way. They especially didn't like some hillbilly in dirty coveralls making their engineers look stupid. But they needed him. Machines broke, and McVeigh fixed them faster than anyone else. So they watched him, waited, hoped he'd screw up badly enough to justify busting him back to infantry. The Sahara would give them that chance. Rear Admiral Winfield Forrest arrived at the North African staging ground the same way he arrived everywhere, 15 minutes early, uniform pressed to knife-edge precision, and carrying a leather-bound copy of the Army Technical Manual like it was a Bible. He wasn't supposed to be there. Forrest was Navy, a career man who'd spent 20 years designing ship engines in a Philadelphia office. But the North African campaign needed supply lines, and supply lines needed vehicles, and vehicles needed someone who understood logistics. The brass had pulled Forrest from his desk and given him a field commission to oversee the mechanized transport division. On paper, it made sense. In practice, it meant putting a man who'd never worked on anything that couldn't be hoisted by a crane in charge of keeping jeeps alive in the desert. The Willys MB models arrived on a Tuesday, rolling off transport ships in Casablanca like they were fresh off the showroom floor. 48 of them, painted in desert tan, smelling of factory grease and new rubber. Forrest inspected each one personally, running his hand along the hoods, checking the tension on fan belts, cross-referencing engine serial numbers against his manifest. He treated those jeeps the way some men treated their children, with an obsessive pride that bordered on religious devotion. McVeigh was elbow-deep in a transmission when Forrest found him. "Private McVeigh." The voice had the clipped precision of a man who'd learned to speak by reading instruction manuals. McVeigh pulled himself out from under the jeep, wiping his hands on a rag that was somehow dirtier than his hands. "Sir." Forrest looked at him the way you'd look at a stain on a white tablecloth. The grease under McVeigh's fingernails, the coveralls that hadn't been washed in 3 weeks, the fact that McVeigh was chewing tobacco while working on government property. "I've read your service record." Forrest's tone suggested he'd read it the same way you'd read a coroner's report. Multiple citations for unauthorized modifications, 17 violations of standard maintenance protocol, a formal reprimand for— He paused, as if the words physically pained him. "Willful deviation from technical specifications." McVeigh spat tobacco juice into the sand. "Engines ran, didn't they?" "That's not the point." Forrest pulled a manual from his jacket pocket, flipped to a dog-eared page. "The United States military operates on standards, Private. These standards exist because engineers, Real engineers with degrees from institutions like MIT and Carnegie Mellon have calculated the optimal performance parameters for every component in these vehicles. Your job is not to improvise. Your job is to follow the manual. He tapped the page with his finger like he was hammering a nail. These Jeeps represent the pinnacle of American engineering. They are designed to operate in any environment, under any condition. They don't need your hillbilly modifications. McVeigh looked past Forrest at the rows of pristine Jeeps, their radiators gleaming in the African sun. He'd already spotted the problem. The fin spacing was too tight, designed for European mud, not Saharan sand. But he knew better than to argue. Not yet. Understood, sir. Forrest smiled. It was the smile of a man who believed he'd just won. Good. I'm assigning you to motor pool maintenance. Touch nothing without consulting the manual first. He turned to leave, then paused. And Private, get yourself a clean uniform. You're a disgrace to the Corps. McVeigh watched him walk away, then looked back at the Jeeps. Beautiful machines, perfectly engineered, completely wrong for the desert they were about to enter. He gave them 3 weeks before they started dying. McVeigh saw the death sentence written in the radiator cores. It took him 3 days of watching the Jeeps run through their break-in cycles to confirm what his gut had been screaming since the moment he'd seen them. The problem wasn't the engines. Willys had built those tough enough to survive anything. The problem was the cooling system. Specifically, the radiator fins were packed tighter than a politician's promises, designed for the mud and rain of Europe, where airflow was easy and debris was soft. Out here, where the air was thick with sand fine as talcum powder, those fins would clog within hours. Clogged fins meant reduced cooling capacity. Reduced cooling meant overheating. Overheating meant seizure. Seizure meant corpses made of steel. He tried the official route first, wrote up a maintenance report, complete with measurements and calculations done on the back of a cigarette carton, delivered it to Forrest's tent at 0600 hours, before the Admiral had finished his coffee. Forrest read it standing up, his face cycling through confusion, annoyance, and finally condescension. Private. These radiators were designed by General Motors engineers. He dropped the report on his desk like it was contaminated. I think they understand thermodynamics better than a tobacco farmer. Sir, I'm just saying the fin spacing is precisely calculated for optimal heat transfer. See Technical Manual 10, 1513, Section 4, Paragraph 12. Forrest picked up his coffee mug. Dismissed. McVeigh tried twice more. Once with a sergeant who told him to stop wasting everyone's time. Once with a captain who actually listened for 30 seconds before laughing and saying, "Son, if you're smarter than GM's entire engineering department, why are you still a private?" So McVeigh did what he always did when the smart people stopped listening. He fixed the problem himself. He started small, modifying his own assigned Jeep during off hours. Pulled the radiator core and carefully bent every third fin outward, increasing the spacing by 3 millimeters. Fabricated a crude external fan assembly from salvaged tractor parts and mounted it on the front bumper with baling wire and repurposed mounting brackets. The bypass valve was the crown jewel, a tin can contraption that looked like folk art but allowed him to manually control coolant flow when the temperature spiked. The other mechanics noticed. Of course they noticed. "What in the hell is that?" Corporal Davis pointed at the external fan, like McVeigh had mounted a dead animal on the hood. "Additional cooling capacity." "It looks like you robbed a junkyard." Word spread fast in a motor pool. By dinner, half the company had walked by to gawk at McVeigh's Frankenstein. By the next morning, someone had spray-painted a name on the hood. The Mudfly. By the end of the week, the mess hall had turned it into entertainment. "Hey, McVeigh, your Jeep throw up on itself? Admiral's gonna bust you back to latrine duty for that monstrosity. What's next, wooden wheels? Maybe some hay bales for bumpers?" The mechanics laughed. The officers sneered. Even the privates who barely knew a carburetor from a camshaft felt entitled to an opinion. McVeigh ate his powdered eggs in silence, let them have their fun. He'd heard worse growing up poor in the Ozarks. Besides, mockery was just noise. The desert would have the last word. And deserts, McVeigh knew, didn't laugh. They just killed whatever couldn't adapt. Alger Hiss Walker was the kind of supply sergeant who understood that war ran on two currencies, official requisitions and unofficial favors. The army had trained him to track every bolt, washer, and gasket that moved through his warehouse. Life had trained him to know when the rules needed bending. He found McVeigh behind the motor pool at 2300 hours, working by flashlight, trying to fabricate a fan blade from a piece of scrap aluminum using nothing but a file and determination. "You know Forrest's got eyes on you, right?" Hiss Walker lit a cigarette, the match briefly illuminating a face that had seen too many supply shortages to believe in official channels. "Word is he's waiting for you to screw up bad enough to bring formal charges." McVeigh didn't look up from his work. "Then I better not screw up." "That thing gonna work?" Hiss Walker nodded at the mudfly, its hood open like a patient on an operating table, the makeshift cooling system half assembled in the darkness. "It'll work." "How do you know?" "Because it has to." McVeigh set down the file, flexed his cramped fingers. "Those radiators are going to clog the first time we hit deep sand. Might take a week, might take a day, but they're going to fail. And when they do, men are going to die because some engineer in Detroit never worked a day in actual dirt." Hiss Walker took a long drag, thinking. "What do you need?" That's how it started. Hiss Walker couldn't requisition parts for an unauthorized modification. That would leave a paper trail straight to a court-martial. But he could lose inventory. A box of ball bearings here, some copper tubing there. A 6-blade industrial fan assembly that somehow fell off a truck during transport. Nothing official. Nothing documented. Just one man who understood survival helping another man trying to ensure it. The external fan was the obvious piece. Brutal, ungainly, but effective. McVeigh mounted it to a reinforced bracket that bolted directly to the front bumper, powered by a secondary belt system he'd adapted from a generator assembly. It looked like something a sharecropper would build to cool a barn, but the 6 blades pulled air through the radiator at triple the factory rate. The bypass valve was the genius. McVeigh machined it from a salvaged hydraulic cylinder, using tin cans and rubber gaskets to create a manual override for the coolant flow. When the temperature climbed, he could twist that valve and flood the engine block with coolant, bypassing the clogged radiator entirely. It was crude. It was inefficient by engineering standards. It worked. He finished the installation on a Sunday morning, while the rest of the company was at chapel service. Hiss Walker stood watch, smoking his way through half a pack of Lucky Strikes. When McVeigh finally turned the key and the mudfly rumbled to life, that ugly, uneven idle punctuated by the rhythmic whoop, whoop, whoop of the external fan. Both men grinned like kids who'd just gotten away with something. "Forrest sees this. He's gonna have a stroke," Hiss Walker said. "Let him." McVeigh wiped his hands on his coveralls, held up the bypass valve, turned it slowly in the morning light. The tin can components glinted like jewelry made from junk. "When the heat comes, this ugly bastard's going to be the prettiest thing in the desert." 3 weeks later, the convoy rolled out. 48 jeeps heading into the deep Sahara. 47 built to the manual's exact specifications. One built by a hillbilly who trusted his hands more than blueprints. The devil's breath was waiting. Are you enjoying this look at hidden history? If you want more stories like Clyde's, hit that like button and tell us, what's the best makeshift fix you've ever seen? The orders came down on August the 12th, 1942. 48 jeeps, 200 men, and enough supplies to establish a forward operating base 300 miles into the Sahara. Intelligence had reported German reconnaissance patrols in the region. High Command wanted a presence. Forrest wanted glory. Nobody asked the thermometers for an opinion. The convoy rolled out at 0600 hours, when the temperature was still a merciful 95 degrees. McVeigh drove position 47, second to last in the column, close enough to eat everyone's dust but far enough back that nobody had to look at the mudfly's ugly mug. The external fan hummed its off-kilter rhythm. The other drivers' radios crackled with jokes about the junk pile bringing up the rear. By noon, the jokes had stopped. The Sahara had a reputation for heat, but what rolled in that afternoon wasn't weather. It was something biblical. The locals called it Nafas al-Shaitan, the devil's breath. A rare meteorological event where high-pressure systems collided over the desert, creating a thermal dome that turned the sand into a griddle and the air into something you had to chew before breathing. The temperature climbed past 105, then 110, then 115, and kept climbing like it had somewhere important to be. McVeigh felt it before he saw it. That subtle shift in how an engine sounds when it's starting to cook, the slight ping in the valve train, the way the temperature gauge needle crept right, even though everything should have been running cool. He reached for his bypass valve, gave it a quarter turn. Coolant flooded the system. The needle steadied. Ahead of him, the other jeeps weren't so lucky. The first geyser erupted at 13:17 hours. McVeigh saw the plume of steam shoot 15 feet into the air from the lead vehicle, the radiator cap launching like a mortar round. The jeep lurched to a stop. The driver jumped out, cursing, watching coolant paint the sand dark. Within minutes, 3 more geysers. Then 5. Then a dozen. The radio channels lit up with panic. Temperatures redlined. Coolant pressure's gone critical. Request permission to halt for repairs. Forrest's voice cut through the chatter, sharp and certain. Negative. Maintain formation. These are temporary cooling issues. The systems will stabilize once we reduce speed. McVeigh watched the temperature gauge on his own dash. 118 degrees, 120. The Mudfly's engine ran hot, but it ran. The bypass valve in his hand was warm to the touch, the tin can components doing their crude, beautiful work. Ahead, another geyser. Then another. The column slowed to a crawl, vehicles limping forward on engines that were already beginning to die. McVeigh could hear it in the mechanical symphony around him, the pitch changes, the valve clatter, the desperate knocking of pistons trying to work in cylinders where the clearances were shrinking by the minute. He toggled his radio. "Sir, we need to stop. These engines can't take this heat." Forrest's response was ice-cold despite the inferno. "Your opinion is noted and dismissed, Private. All vehicles will maintain operational status per manual specifications." McVeigh looked at the bypass valve in his hand, then at the temperature gauge. 121 degrees and climbing. The manual said this was impossible. The manual said American engineering could handle any environment. The manual, McVeigh thought, was about to learn a very expensive lesson. The first engine died at 14:04 hours with a sound like a gunshot. Corporal Davis's Jeep, position 12, running strong one moment and then seizing so violently the rear wheels locked and skidded in the sand. The temperature had hit 122 degrees. The radiator fins had clogged completely with sand so fine it passed through the grill like smoke. Without airflow, the coolant had flash-boiled. Without coolant, the pistons expanded beyond tolerance. The engine didn't gradually fail. It welded itself into a single block of useless metal in under 3 seconds. Davis sat behind the wheel, hands still gripping it, staring at the hood like he'd just watched someone die. In a way, he had. Then the death ticks started. That's what the mechanics called it afterward. Those who survived to tell the story. That rapid tick, 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 tick of a metal expanding beyond its design limits. The sound of molecular bonds stretching and snapping, of clearances vanishing and parts fusing together. It was the audio signature of an engine's death rattle, and once you heard it, you had maybe 30 seconds before catastrophe. Position 7 went next, then position 19, then positions 4, 23, and 31 in quick succession, like dominoes falling in slow motion. Each death followed the same pattern: the ticking, a geyser of steam, the horrible grinding sound of pistons trying to move through cylinder walls they'd welded themselves to, then silence. The kind of silence that only comes when something mechanical stops fighting and accepts its fate. McVeigh counted them. Not because he wanted to, but because his mind couldn't stop doing the mathematics. Every dead engine was a vehicle that would need towing. Every vehicle that needed towing was weight. Every pound of weight meant slower travel, more exposure, more vulnerability. The numbers painted a picture he didn't want to see. By 1500 hours, 19 engines had seized. By 1600 hours, 34. The convoy had stopped moving entirely, strung out across 3 miles of open desert like a wounded snake. Men stood beside their dead jeeps, some attempting repairs that were impossible. You can't unscramble an egg, and you can't unweld a piston. Others just sat in whatever shade they could find, watching the temperature gauge on their functioning vehicles climb toward the same inevitable fate. Forrest stood beside his command jeep at position 1, radio handset pressed to his ear, trying to raise headquarters for extraction. The radio worked fine. The engine did not. McVeigh watched from 400 yards back as steam began pouring from under the Admiral's hood, watched him slam it down like closing a coffin lid. Position 1. The flagship. Built exactly to specifications. Dead. The irony would have been funny if they weren't stranded in a valley that intelligence had flagged as an active German patrol route. 300 miles from base. No air support available. No rescue convoy that could reach them before nightfall. Just 47 corpses made of steel, 200 men, and enough heat to cook them all. McVeigh sat in the mudfly, listening to his engine idle. The external fan spun. The bypass valve held steady in his hand, warm but not burning. The temperature gauge read 118 degrees, hot enough to kill a normal engine, but the mudfly wasn't normal. Around him, black smoke rose from seized engines like funeral pyres. The smell of burned oil and superheated metal made the air taste like a foundry. And somewhere out there in the shimmering heat waves, McVeigh knew German scouts were watching through binoculars, counting the smoke signals, calculating when to strike. The sound cut through the funeral silence like a resurrection. Whoop, 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 whoop. 200 men turned toward the rear of the column, where that ugly, uneven rhythm was growing louder. The mudfly rolled past position 46, past 39, past 22, weaving between the corpses of properly engineered vehicles. The external fan blades caught the sun, throwing spinning shadows across the sand. Tin cans glinted on the bypass valve assembly. Baling wire held half the cooling system together like surgical sutures on a patient who refused to die. McVeigh drove slowly, not out of caution, but out of respect for the dead. He could feel every set of eyes on him as he passed, could read the mixture of disbelief and anger and desperate hope on faces that had been certain rescue was days away. The mudfly's engine didn't purr. It growled and coughed and complained like an old man climbing stairs. But it ran. God help him. It ran. He brought it to a stop 20 yards from Forrest's position and killed the engine. The silence that followed was worse than the mechanical carnage. McVeigh climbed out, boots hitting sand that was hot enough to melt rubber, and stood beside the hood. He pulled a canteen from his belt, took a long drink of water that tasted like hot metal, and allowed himself that small, knowing smile. Behind him, the mudfly's engine ticked as it cooled, not the death ticks of an engine destroying itself, but the healthy tick of metal contracting after honest work. Steam rose gently from the radiator, normal operating temperature steam, not the violent geysers of catastrophic failure. Forrest walked toward him like a man approaching his own execution. The Admiral's uniform, usually immaculate, was dark with sweat and dust. His face had gone from red to a dangerous purple. Every step seemed to cost him something more valuable than energy. Pride, maybe. Certainty. The absolute faith that regulations and specifications could substitute for understanding. He stopped 5 feet away, close enough to talk, far enough to maintain the illusion of authority. "Private McVeigh." The words came out stiff, like they'd been rehearsed. "Your vehicle appears to be operational." McVeigh took another pull from his canteen. "Yes, sir." "How is that possible?" It wasn't really a question. It was an accusation wrapped in confusion, demanding an explanation for why the universe had betrayed everything Forrest believed about proper engineering. The radiator fins are spaced wider. External fan increases airflow by 300%. Bypass valve lets me flood the block when the temperature spikes. McVeigh gestured at the tin can components with his canteen. "Hillbilly engineering, sir. Just like you said." Forrest's jaw worked like he was chewing glass. Around them, the other men had gathered close enough to hear, forming a semicircle of witnesses. The Admiral looked at them, then at the smoking wreckage of his perfect fleet, then back at the mudfly with its junkyard modifications and its steady, contemptuous idle. "I need you to transport command personnel to the forward rally point." Each word came out like Forrest was pulling his own teeth. "We need to establish radio contact and coordinate extraction for the convoy." "You want a ride, sir?" McVeigh's voice was flat. No mockery, no triumph. Just a hillbilly mechanic stating facts. Forrest's face went from purple to grey. "Yes, Private. I need a ride." McVeigh nodded, took one last drink, and screwed the cap back on his canteen. "Then I guess you better climb in, sir. That junk pile's got work to do." McVeigh didn't just offer transportation. He offered salvation with a price tag made of humiliation. "We'll need to tow your command vehicle, sir." It was already walking toward the Admiral's dead jeep, pulling a length of chain from the mudfly's cargo bed. "Can't leave sensitive radio equipment for the Germans to find. Plus you'll want your maps and communication logs." Forrest opened his mouth to protest, then closed it. They both knew McVeigh was right. They also both knew what this meant. The Admiral's pristine, by-the-book command vehicle being dragged through the desert behind a Frankenstein machine built by a hillbilly with baling wire and contempt for regulations. The hitching took 15 minutes. McVeigh worked methodically, wrapping the chain around both frames, testing the connections with pulls that would have broken lesser links. Forrest stood watching, along with half the stranded convoy. Nobody spoke. What was there to say? The evidence was everywhere. 47 smoking corpses of American engineering versus one ugly bastard that refused to quit. They set out at 16:47 hours. McVeigh behind the wheel, Forrest in the passenger seat, the dead command jeep dragging behind them like a reluctant corpse. The added weight cut their speed to 15 miles per hour. The temperature was still 119 degrees. The sun hammered down with the kind of heat that made your eyeballs ache. McVeigh's hand never left the bypass valve. Every 10 minutes he'd feel that subtle change in the engine note, the slight ping that meant the temperature was climbing, and he'd give the valve a quarter turn. Coolant would flood the system. The temperature would stabilize. The mudfly would keep pulling, keep breathing. Keep defying every specification that said this shouldn't work. Forrest watched McVeigh's hands more than the road, watched how he adjusted the valve by sound and feel rather than waiting for the gauge to tell him there was a problem. Watched how he shifted gears with a smoothness that came from understanding exactly how much stress the transmission could take. This wasn't driving. This was a conversation between a man and a machine, conducted in a language the Admiral had never learned despite 20 years of engineering school. "Why didn't you follow procedure?" Forrest's voice was quiet, almost lost beneath the engine noise and the scrape of chain on sand. McVeigh kept his eyes on the horizon. "I did follow procedure, sir. just not the one written by men who've never had to make a tractor run with no parts and no money. The Ozarks taught me that a manual is a suggestion. Survival is the only rule that matters. They drove for 6 hours. 40 miles through sand that tried to swallow the tires, through heat that would have killed a normal engine in minutes, through terrain that made every mile feel like 10. The mudfly's temperature gauge danced between acceptable and dangerous, but it never crossed into critical. McVeigh's Backwoods mathematics, the wider fin spacing, the external airflow, the manual override, held against conditions that had murdered 47 engines built by men with degrees from MIT. When they finally reached the forward rally point at 22:47 hours, the mudfly was still running. Not smoothly, not quietly, but running. The external fan still spun. The bypass valve still worked. The tin cans still glinted in the moonlight, like medals made from garbage. McVeigh killed the engine and climbed out, his coveralls soaked through with sweat, his hands trembling from 6 hours of constant adjustment. Behind him, the Admiral's command jeep sat in the sand, dead but delivered, dragged 40 miles by a machine that shouldn't have existed. Forrest sat in the passenger seat for a long moment before getting out. When he finally spoke, his voice carried something that might have been respect. "You were right, Private." McVeigh nodded. "Yes, sir, I know." The report landed on the desk of Lieutenant General George Patton 3 weeks after the Devil's Breath incident, marked urgent, and signed by Rear Admiral Winfield Forrest. It was 7 pages long, single-spaced, and represented the most painful document Forrest had ever written. The title read, Field Assessment. Superiority of Adaptive Cooling Modifications in Extreme Desert Environments. Buried in the technical language and careful phrasing was a confession. The hillbilly had been right. The engineers in Detroit had designed radiators for Europe's mud, not Africa's sand. The manual had failed. Standard specifications had killed 47 engines and nearly cost the lives of 200 men. Private Clyde McVeigh's unauthorized modifications, the wider fin spacing, the external fan assembly, the tin can bypass valve, had been the only thing standing between a stranded battalion and a German patrol that never came. Forrest recommended 3 things: immediate commendation for McVeigh, a full review of all desert operation cooling systems, and the retroactive authorization of field modifications when circumstances demanded deviation from standard protocol. It was bureaucratic language for "we were wrong." The Army moved faster than anyone expected. By October 1942, McVeigh's bypass valve design had been shipped to Detroit. By December, Willis Overland was producing a factory version, cleaner, prettier, but fundamentally identical to the tin can original. By March 1943, every Jeep deployed to North Africa came equipped with what the manual now called Enhanced Desert Cooling Package, Modification 7B. The mechanics called it the McVeigh valve. McVeigh himself never saw the mass production. He'd been rotated stateside in November, his enlistment period completed, his contribution to the war effort secured in a way that didn't require him to fire a single shot. The Army offered him a promotion, a training position teaching field mechanics. He declined. The Ozarks were calling, and he'd been away from the tobacco fields too long. He returned to the Hollow in December 1942, catching a ride from Springfield in the back of a farmer's truck, his duffel bag containing a commendation letter he never showed anyone, and a photograph of himself standing beside the mudfly, that crooked smile on his face, the bypass valve visible in his hand. The farm was exactly as he'd left it, the same lean-to shed, the same rusted tractors waiting for resurrection. His father met him at the door, looked him up and down, and said, "Welcome back. Johnson's combine threw a rod yesterday. Said you might take a look." No parade, no ceremony. Just a broken machine and the expectation that McVeigh would fix it. Because that's what he did. He worked that shed for another 40 years, fixing equipment that certified mechanics had declared dead, using baling wire and coffee cans and an understanding of engines that went deeper than any manual. Farmers came from 3 counties over, bringing machinery the dealerships couldn't save. McVeigh saved it. He never charged much. A chicken, some cornmeal, maybe a day's help when his own fields needed working. He never talked about the war, never mentioned the mudfly or the admiral or the 47 engines that died in the Devil's Breath. When people asked, he'd just shrug and say, "Fixed some jeeps, did my part." But in motor pools across North Africa, mechanics told the story differently. They told it the way legends should be told, about a hillbilly who proved that sometimes the smartest engineer in the room is the one with grease under his fingernails and dirt on his coveralls. The one who understands that survival doesn't come from following the manual. It comes from knowing when to throw the manual away. Don't forget to share this video with a history buff. Who do you think was right, the admiral or the mechanic? Let us know in the comments.